here and there. So just a reminder, we are swapping the schedule a little bit right now. We have the slippery slope of unethical programming, and right after we have magic of ADB and Android Shell. Did you want to say hello before we get started?
Yeah, just hello everyone. This is not a technical talk, so I'm about to get some stuff wrong and make some people angry. So enjoy.
Awesome. Thank you. And if you have questions at any point throughout the talk, after the talk, feel free to post them in day 2, Jacques' channel for this talk. We're doing Q&A through Slack, so feel free to post your questions there. And with that, let's kick things off.
Hello there. I'm Jacques Smuts. I am an Android developer, and I come from South Africa, a liberal rainbow nation that still carries the legacy of its deeply entrenched racist past. I've been doing Android work since 2013. Now I am a developer at Nomanini, a company that operates in informal markets in Africa and places a high priority on the ethics and on the impact of the code that we produce. But before Nomanini, I worked at various other companies. I regret some of the code I've written, and I've spoken to many people who have committed unethical code like myself. Sometimes we didn't realize what we were doing, but sometimes we did. One day, this message appeared in the company chat. Ignoring ethical considerations for a moment, would it be possible to fake or censor data randomly, but it results in identical data across different devices? It turns out he was asking something perfectly innocent, and the faked data was for a purely aesthetic purpose, with no changes to the actual data. And we never implemented it anyway. The reason I show this is to demonstrate how we think unethical programming works. We think it will be tagged. We think someone will come up to us and say, I need you to help me fake this emissions test, but don't tell anyone. And then we will have the opportunity to say no. But real life is not that easy. Life is more opaque. So I'll give you some examples. I joined the company and I was the only mobile developer. Not actually me. Names and facts changed for dramatic effect. The company I joined was some obviously nonsense startup called Unethical. I was young, naive, and I needed the money, so I joined Unethical. I was in charge of deploying the Android and iOS apps, which meant I technically also had access to the analytics that the agency had put in. I was quite excited because I was reading up about UX and wanted to see what I could do to increase engagement. I wanted to dive in and write up a report, but then I was told to stop, that the analytics info was proprietary. And I was not allowed to share that info with anyone because it would be unprofessional, not even with my colleagues. It made sense to me at the time, and anyway, I needed the money, so I kept quiet. Later, I figured out that the reason the analytics data was kept secret was because the analytics showed something bad if you add the numbers. A normal app would have something like 300,000 installs, and if it was good, maybe like 100,000 active users. This is a healthy app. Unethical had 300,000 installs and less than 1,000 active users. It was clear that the installation numbers were paid for. They were fake. The number of installations on the Play Store was used to get investors to think we had an active user base. And the worst is the marketing team had no idea that their marketing materials were based upon lies. And at first, I had no idea that they used these fake installation numbers for investment pitches. So because of an effective encapsulation of knowledge, the marketing team was telling lies and they didn't even know it. I also later learned that the company had outsourced app growth to a dude who called himself a growth hacker. So instead of relying on the marketing team to spread the word about the app, the company had outsourced to someone who didn't have qualms about using bots to get installs. By the time I figured out what was happening, I was already dependent on the company for my salary, and I needed the company to be successful to continue getting a salary. I'd entered into a bit of a dependency hell, and I had to protect myself. I did not feel confident that I would be able to get a new job at that point, and I was scared. So I continued to say nothing about the analytics to my colleagues, and by that point I was willingly engaging in lies, which means that I was also culpable for those lies. There was this slippery slope of culpability, and I fell right into it. At this point, I was feeling guilty and completely unsure of myself, and eventually I managed to get a job elsewhere and I left. I mean, my friend got a job elsewhere and left. This didn't happen to me. But this pattern of falling into unethical behavior that you didn't quite see coming or felt you couldn't say no to, this would repeat. So I thought about this story and similar scenarios that other programmers have experienced. And I came up with this pattern that promotes unethical programming. I understand that everyone has different ideas about what constitutes unethical code, but I feel that regardless of your personal code of ethics, you can agree that what you build is strongly reflected by the environment in which you build. If you work for Amazon in Seattle, you'll build vastly different tools than if you build for a postal service in London or Alibaba in Hangzhou. I feel that the ethics of the organization you work for has the strongest impact on the code that you actually...
Welcome to the Smuts seminar on manipulating programmers. You want your resources to do things that they don't want to do. Your resources have this thing called morals or preferences. There's no established code of ethics for programmers, so it's completely a personal thing, which is great for you because that means that coders don't trust in any outside authority, making you the primary authority. So how do you manipulate programmers? With the patented Smuts secret 6-step system. And I know, it's a lot to say and it's a bit of a tongue twister, but trust me, it's easier to say than unionize. First, you need a strong encapsulation of knowledge. Your resources must only... don't call them resources to their face, of course. Your resources must only have enough knowledge to do their jobs. It's also very important to tell them not to share any knowledge, even with their trusted colleagues, in the interest of safety and security and professionalism. Keeping workers ignorant will prevent them from discovering unethical behavior and leaving, but it won't actually get them to do unethical things. You'll need to foster dependency hell. If your employee is an independent and successful individual, it will be difficult to convince them to do anything. So you need to focus on the employees who are desperate, the ones who are anxious and fearful and dependent on you. If they fear the loss of their job, they'll probably be willing to lower their standards a bit. Immigrants on work visas are great, as well as, well, let's not say the quiet part out loud, shall we? Just-in-time specifications. Give requirements and specifications at the last possible minute. An idle CPU is a dangerous thing, so make sure your resources are always fully occupied. As soon as they're done with one task, their mind must already be stressed out about the next task. They won't have time to ask why if they're too busy trying to figure out how. Other professionals are given time to develop personal skills. Tell them to develop those skills at home, otherwise they might use that time to research unimportant things like ethics. Slowly increasing coupling of culpability. This is an advanced technique. You have to make your resources culpable, but slowly. You cannot throw someone into the deep end of a morally grey operation. You must first get them personally invested in the health of the company. We are all a family, after all. Make them believe that relaxing users' security standards is for the greater good. We have deadlines. Salaries need to be paid. Your stock options will be worth more if we make this deadline. And we can always add accessibility features later. Outsourcing the obvious. If all else fails, or a task is just too obviously immoral, outsource it. Ask a reliable team to build the framework, but then let an outsourced team add that one feature that exploits users and sells their data. The best part is that this denies any member of your team the opportunity to say no or to make a stand until it's far too late. Some people love to stand up for what they think is right, so don't give them that opportunity. The sixth step is perhaps the most important one. I call it the
What this means is that if you have to follow orders from an authoritarian government or a company whose values are decided by shareholders instead of employees, the chances are good that your voice and ethics will not be reflected in the final product. If you don't have a voice, you will be used as a mere tool to produce code. I found that the best companies to work for are transparent, honest, and make their values clear to both employees and clients. Companies that ask for teamwork and cooperation towards a common goal are more likely to be cognizant of the impact of their product than companies with a strongly enforced top-down or hierarchical structure. We like to think of evil actions as simplistic things that are caused by bad individuals. But in reality, life is much more complex, and evil actions are often the result of larger incentive structures. The structure of a company has a strong influence on the final product and can still result in evil actions even if every employee in that company means well. So, for example, a company can decide to build code for a specific purpose, but then have that code be co-opted for a different purpose later. Or everyone in that company might be ignorant of a specific downside of their technology, maybe because their staff isn't diverse. You think of a wearable sensor which doesn't work on darker skin tones because no one on the company had darker skin tones. And finally, companies which make it easy to separate the product from the user of that product can easily do things that are harmful to the users without even realizing it or without caring. This is all getting a bit abstract, so I've got one more story for you. I was working for this company called the Fictional Mobile Agency. At FMA, we had many employees and things were good. But then we lost our biggest clients overnight. We were looking at retrenchments and perhaps the bankruptcy and collapse of the company. It was pretty bad. Then I got this message. We have an important client coming in, and we need you to spearhead the Android project. We really need this client. I was happy. This would help save the company from ruin and maybe give me that promotion I felt I was due. I was young and naive and I needed the money. And also this didn't happen to me, this was someone else. So during onboarding, they told me it's an app which has constantly changing data and you just have to serve stats and odds to the client and make sure that whenever the user interacts with the app, to keep getting the latest data as frequently as possible. It's a cool technical challenge. And there was a lot to... it was a gambling app. A sports betting app. They knew it was a problematic client. And it's the only client that they never advertised on their website. They didn't ask me if I have any concerns because they couldn't afford me to say no. They really, really needed the client. Otherwise, there would be even more retrenchments or the company would die. However, I really didn't know how to feel about working on an app where people gambled. The nice thing is that it wasn't technically a gambling app, it was a sports betting app. See, there's a difference because the odds are external and they are shown upfront to the user, no hidden odds. It was totally fine. It was fine. So I wrote this. I'm willing to work on this app because I understand the need. However, there are some lines I am not willing to cross. For example, notification-based user retention. And then some other stuff that will be forgotten, and exploitative behavior in general. They agreed and I kept working, despite not being too happy about it. And I thought things were fine. But then one day I saw the app in production and it was different from the one I had developed. The reason being that I had put in a web view just to show the latest sports events. And I had put in a third-party service to handle notifications. And it turns out this third-party service was being used by the client to push notifications that I'm pretty sure would specifically target gambling addicts. They were using their own analytics on their server to identify whales. In other words, I had built the framework which facilitates exploitation. I didn't do any of the exploitation myself, technically. But gambling addiction, it destroys lives and families. And I had paved the road to make it easy for our client to get direct access to gambling addicts' phones. I remember I saw advertisements on national TV during big events for my app, and I was not proud. It was pretty terrible. This time, it wasn't just me that was being handled and producing unethical code that I didn't want. It was also the coding agency I worked for, because it turns out that the client had handled fictional mobile agency in a similar way to how Pinafirely Tocker had handled me. For example, encapsulated knowledge was there. We didn't know how the third-party libraries would be used until we saw it in production. We were fully dependent on them because we really needed the money, not just for ourselves, but for our colleagues. There was a pipeline of culpability because I felt responsible for helping to keep my colleagues' jobs, and I started to justify why it's totally fine for me to build this app that I would like to believe I wouldn't have done otherwise. And finally, the client had outsourced the obvious by putting the exploitative behavior inside web views or in outsourced notification services that we as an agency had less knowledge of. This stuff happens all the time, every day, in small moments, whenever some developer or business feels that they don't have the right to object or they really need the client. I've compiled a list of some relevant headlines or cases that I saw in the past year. Not all of these are necessarily unethical, but I think they're all relevant to the larger discussion of ethics in tech. Hey, so at this point, I had a bunch of examples of unethical behavior in tech. Unfortunately, I feel a bit better not showing that list because it names specific companies and specific misdeeds. And well, I don't want to alienate anyone or focus like that, because my concerns are more about the industry as a whole rather than any particular company. So let me just list the types of headlines that I'm sure many of you have seen over the past year. These include data leaks, election fraud, loot boxes for children, toxic work environments, legal sales of private data, illegal sale of private data, automated wage theft, automated employee control systems, military contracts, facial recognition, antitrust lawsuits, private distribution monopolies, unencrypted communications, crunch, automated discrimination, remote disabling of paid features or remote disabling of entire products, tracking pixels in emails, legacy systems that cause billions of dollars in damage, or bad code or bad UX that results in multiple deaths. There are more, but you get the idea. If you do want more, you ask me in private, I guess. So the question is, how can you be more ethical despite strong incentives to be unethical? Well, first, choose an employer with a good code of ethics. No one will force a code of ethics on your employer. So you'll have to choose an employer which even has one. Gather information inside the company. Some companies are very transparent and some are less so. In order to know what your company is really doing, you need to build relationships and explore and research inside the company on your own to make sure you understand what's really going on. Be aware of the implications of your code. You have to be aware of the impact your code really has on the world. Sometimes, if you have a good employer, they kind of do that for you. They help think what the impact is. But usually you have to build up your own knowledge base, regardless of what your employer does. Be willing to say no. Sometimes a line is crossed and you have to practice a willingness to say no. Be willing to leave immediately. Well, I mean, it's difficult to say no if you don't feel you can leave. And finally, go to one. You're going to have to repeat this a few times. Now, if you're able to follow this list, it would help you to personally be more ethical. The problem is that all of these things are exceptionally difficult to do if you're not successful or social, or if you're lacking in energy for medical reasons. So, I mean, my list can essentially be changed to this. Be privileged. By which I mean be a senior coder with high employability and some spare money. And I mean, basically, if you're a rich white man, then it's fairly easy to follow this list. Unfortunately, if you are a very privileged person, it's even easier to not even care about ethics at all and believe that you are beyond good and evil, or that selfishness is good. So what about those who are not lucky enough to have all this privilege? Young people new in the industry, immigrants on work visas, people who expect to face discrimination in hiring, or people who are afraid of losing their job because they are the sole breadwinner in the family. For people who don't have all this privilege, there's no easy answer to be more ethical in your job. If you are unlucky and you get stuck between poverty and ethics, and you don't really have a choice, do you? I mean, you're just going to have to try your best until your career advances enough for you to have the power to say no. Oh, that's terrible. I mean, the good news is that in the world of tech, careers advance easier than in other fields. The bad news is that for every person whose career advances successfully, another 2 new people enter the industry and maybe they're unable to say no. So, if you are a senior enough person to have a voice in how things are done, it is doubly important for you to be a leader who considers ethics, to reach out and listen to the concerns of those who may not voice those concerns unprompted. it's important for you to foster a culture within your organization where it's easy for someone to call out unethical behavior without fearing consequences, within reason. You should build up your team not just in proficiency, but in ethics. That's a lot to ask, though, because, there's no obvious benefit to you personally to do that. There's not necessarily a big material incentive to fight for more ethical workspace, but it is the right thing to do. So maybe a better question isn't how to be more ethical, but should I be more ethical? If it is tough to code ethically, should you? Well, from a purely selfish point of view, no. There are basically zero punishments unless you break the law personally, and even then, the law is a bit behind when it comes to computer science sometimes. But is that a situation we want, though? Can we rely on just the law and your employer? It's illegal to lie about prices or to misrepresent a product or to fake an emissions test, but if I were to, say, code a mobile game targeted at children, and then I add gambling mechanics, should I face repercussions for that? Or should it all fall on the company for paying me to do that? Right now, I don't really have a right to say no if it's not an illegal request. So yes, the company is wholly at fault for doing things that are bad. However, we should have a right to say no to unethical behavior. As it stands, the repercussions for saying no to your employer is oftentimes higher than the repercussion for coding something that may destroy lives. The only way to combat this is to change the incentive structure. Right now, programmers are mere tools to be used by whoever can afford them. Unlike doctors, we don't have a specific right to say no and expect to keep our job, because we don't have this code of ethics, this oath we take. Unlike barbers, we cannot lose our license to code if we cut someone's ear off. And unlike accountants, there's no recognized authority we can report unethical behavior to. It's kind of just everyone for themselves. But we should have an independent code of ethics and standards that transcends any single organization. We can't just keep relying on people like Troy Hunt to shame people into better security practices. If we want to have standards, we need to organize. Into what, though? The ideal would obviously be if we can organize our society into fully automated luxury communism. That's utopian thinking, though, and until we get there, we need something a bit more scientific, more immediate and specifically applicable to programming. That sounds a little ambitious, but every other profession out there has managed to do it. Why can't we? The process of professionalization is somewhat standard across industries. Historically, people organize into something like a union or a guild or an association, and then they start to implement standards and requirements. They become more specialized, more strict, and they uphold standards of the industry more and more, but at the cost of becoming more gatekept. There's more gatekeeping. Unions are good for protecting people from exploitation, discrimination, wage depreciation, and unions are basically for the workers as a first priority. Unions usually strive to democratize the workplace so that workers actually have a voice in the direction that their company goes. Unions are most necessary and most powerful in situations where people are replaceable and wages are low. Unions are very open to workers, but specifically excludes management and higher ups in order to protect the most vulnerable. So this kind of feels like it doesn't apply to software developers for a lot of people. Like, we are usually fairly well paid, fairly rare, difficult to replace, and because of that, we like to think of ourselves as professionals or temporarily embarrassed millionaires. And so we think that unions don't really apply to us. On the other hand, professional bodies are good for highly skilled professionals who adhere to a code of ethics and standards. And it is very good for the industry and for the members to have that body there. But there is very strong gatekeeping via usually qualification requirements, writing articles, work experience, membership fees, all of that. Historically, this is something that kind of happens over time to specialized professions. Professionalization just it happens to most industries. But they don't spring up overnight. They form over time from less specialized and less standardized organizations, and often competing ones that settle things over time, often with difficult arguments. But software developers, a lot of us don't like gatekeeping. So we don't like the idea of a professional body because it's keeping people out, and software development is for everybody. What all of this means is that even though there are a few professional associations or proto-professional bodies out there, they are still unknown to a lot of developers. Many people want to help professionalize the industry, but they are facing a lack of interest from many developers, even though developers themselves would stand to benefit the most from this process. So right now, there's no unified or agreed upon solution, no official guidelines, no required code of ethics, and oftentimes no repercussions for unethical or irresponsible behavior. Many of you are happy about this. You want freedom for developers so we can move fast and break things. But you should know that the result of this is that young or underprivileged developers, as well as agencies in third world countries, will have no recourse or protection from being exploited by bad actors. And it cuts both ways. How do you know if a software developer you employ is good? You have to do apparently whiteboard tests. You have to test them yourself because there's no independent authority telling you that they are qualified. Just because you personally don't code unethical software doesn't mean you're doing anything to prevent it from happening. And unless we organize in some way, or at least get a democratic spokesperson to be a representative in the government or for the government, unethical code will continue unabated. I see more and more people calling out bad code and bad practices. This is great, but it seems to be happening more at the individual or corporate level. It also means that there is no appeals process. I haven't noticed that there is an increasing move towards unifying developers the way that other professions have. It seems to be happening very slowly. Mostly what I've seen is that corporations are taking control of the frameworks that they're using and filling in the gap left by a lack of professional organization between programmers. The end result is that the quality of code and network of developers is being built, but it's being built for a product or a company rather than for a sector. And thus the independence and transparency that you'd expect from a professional board of ethics cannot.
For you, the one thing you cannot have is programmers.
No.
So, you identify your standards.
No, please.
Don't say that this is an industry standard or a global rule of ethics, because that would undermine your own authority. Listen to them. Empowered as long as
I think this joke has gone on a bit too long. Sorry, everyone.
punish disloyalty and collude with other
company rather than for a sector. And thus the independence and transparency that you'd expect from a professional board of ethics cannot really be achieved. Companies filling this gap with their own simulacra of professional bodies is a good thing, where it provides education for new people to help enter the field, as well as where such organizations facilitate communication between developers. The company is doing its part to uplift standards within that subsector. But the final decision of what those standards are still oftentimes rests within the hand of a company rather than a community. The only exception to that is if a company commits money and or developer time to an outside project or organization, whilst the company retains zero control over that organization. So what steps can we take in the short term? Well, we need a code of ethics. We need shared standards that transcend any single employer or product. Ideally, we need an international organization like, the accountants and the doctors, but these things happen over time and usually at the local level first, long before it reaches international level. But we live in interesting times and things happen internationally first nowadays. It's all very confusing. So if you want to code more ethically, your first step is to join something, connect with people. It so happens that the IWW has their headquarters in Chicago, and this is Chicago Roboto. They're not specifically specialized in coding. They're a big union, but they're very good at helping people organize and connect and communicate, and teaches people how to unify in difficult situations. And there's a lot of good resources and knowledge base there. The biggest coding specific organization, as far as I can tell, seems to be the Association of Computing Machinists. They have a good code of ethics. I've read it, I like it, and they have many members of the world. There is an annual membership fee and a committee for handling complaints of unethical behavior, which is, this is good, really good. Their focus is more on professionalization than on workers' rights. They have already undergone some of the process of professionalization, and that is their focus. But unlike other big professional organizations or professional bodies, they don't have full legal exclusivity of any terms. They don't have legal powers to stop people from calling themselves programmers. They're still at the beginning stages. In some countries, the Tech Workers Coalition have more of a presence than other organizations. And I like that organization for doing a lot of work to educate tech workers about their rights. And they are not restricted to just coders, but they do make very specific room for coders. And I think they are hopefully a very important and influential organization in the future. There are many more organizations out there, oftentimes very local, and I think you should do your part to help make the coding world just a little bit better for the next generation of coders who are entering our world. And finally, just kind of a parting word, if you are already in some sort of community or group with a shared interest in your profession of whatever kind, consider what it would take to codify some ethics, to standardize some rules or guidelines for new members so that they know what not to do. And also consider how difficult it might be to interface with other communities to build something a little bit larger. Professionalization tends to happen in that way, and I think developers should know a little bit more about professionalization and help to kick it forward so that we can build this industry into a better and more ethical place. I will be loading additional details and reading materials and references to my website, so please check it out. And thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that important talk. That was really great. As a reminder for everyone watching, if you have any questions, you can drop them in Slack. All of our Q&A is in Slack. All the channels start with day 2 for today, followed by the speaker's name. So feel free to put any questions there. Did you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to share?
I'm happy to get feedback, and because I also feel very lost when it comes to like ethics and knowing more about how to be a good programmer. So if anyone can provide advice, I would love it. That's about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And with that, I'm gonna pass it off to John.